If you want access to bonus episodes, reading lists for every series of Empire, a chat community, discounts for all the books mentioned in the week's podcast, ad-free listening, and a weekly newsletter, sign up to Empire Club at www.empirepoduk.com.
Hello and welcome to Empire with me, Anita Anand.
And me, William Dalrymple.
Who's sounding so spry considering he's on the other side of the world in Australia, having just come off stage, having just wowed thousands of people. And it's now almost midnight where you are, isn't it?
It is, but I've had quite a few espressos, so I'm quite wide awake and perky, actually.
I know. Slightly worries me, actually, your yin and yang, because you sort of started, we were doing our tech check and you had a gin and tonic, and then you said, oh, just a moment, and you got yourself an espresso. So this cocktail is going to play havoc with your stomach.
I find that it's a very good cocktail, uppers and downers. That's what you need. Yeah.
Are you going to be able to sleep after this? I mean, what are you going to do?
That is more of a worry than how articulate I'm going to be after the gin and tonic, but let's see.
You're going to be fabulously articulate, and there's no one better to talk about this because this is right in your wheelhouse, because we are talking about Babur. Now, this is all sort of, entwined with, there's a fantastic exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, if you get a chance to go, the Great Mughals, art, architecture and opulence. And arguably one of the greatest names, and certainly the first name, is Babur, and someone you know so well because you wrote an introduction to something called the Baburnama. Now, first of all, tell everybody, what is the Baburnama?
So the Baburnama, Babur is the name of the guy, and Nama is the story of. It just means the history of. And we are talking about the man who founded the Mughal Empire, but who, bizarrely, in his own eyes, was a refugee and a failure. And that's the strange irony about this man. He's always sort of held up there. The later Mughals look back to him as the founder of their line. There are a million images of him bestriding the world. But in his own eyes, he never forgave himself for having lost his family estates, which were the other side of the world from India, where he ended up, which were in Central Asia, in what's now Uzbekistan, and he lost them to the Uzbeks.
To the Uzbeks, exactly. So, I mean, this is an origin story, and it's also very divisive in Asia, because you've got, those who say absolutely extraordinary founding of an extraordinary empire that lasted for centuries and left behind such things as the Taj Mahal and the monuments around Delhi.
The glitteriest glitter ever, including, of course, our old friend, the Kohinoor, which probably passes through Babur's hand, or may pass through Babur's hand.
But then you've got the other side, and particularly in India these days, that kind of want to repudiate that Mughal past and say, invaders, they didn't sort of change anything, and the best thing was when they were sort of kicked out. So, I mean, it really interesting and divisive and controversial.
I've got a theory about that. I mean, I think in a sense they've got the wrong guy. Babur clearly was an invader.
Free the Babur one. Is that what you're saying?
Babur did obviously invade India and did take it. And in that sense, yes, he was an invader. But he's come to represent, for a whole series of reasons, which are not to do with him, he's come to represent, along with his great-great-great-great-great-grandson Aurangzeb, everything that Hindu nationalists don't like about Muslims and Muslim rule in Indian history. And because his name was associated with something called the Baburi Masjid, which is this controversial mosque at a place called Ayodhya, which is the site supposedly of the original Ayodhya, which is the capital of Lord Ram, one of the greatest of all the Hindu gods, he has come to represent subsequently to many people all that is worst about Muslim rule. He's meant to be an iconoclast, a jihadi. And yet, if you actually read his autobiography, which is the fullest, most revealing, most well-penned, pre-modern biography probably anywhere before Pepys. And it's that good and that extraordinary. He is none of these things. He is an aesthete. He loves images. He loves nature. He waxes lyrical about fields of flowers or the smell of trees or the smell of leaves burning on a fire. He is incredibly frank about his own very complicated sexuality. the fact that he's quite keen on boys, but has to marry girls to produce heirs and to make diplomatic marriages. And in a sense, he couldn't be more different from the jihadi image that he has for Hindu nationalists. I mean, there are many Muslim rulers who were in India who did terrible acts of iconoclasm and destroyed temples. And Aurangzeb, his great-great-great-great-grandson, was one of those. But Babur is kind of not. For a start, he loves alcohol. He drinks too much. He loves parties. In almost all his writings in Turkic, he calls God Tengri, which is the old animist name for God rather than Allah.
That's fascinating.
And there's this one moment when his back is really against the wall, when he thinks he's going to be defeated right at the end of his career, when he makes a vow to give up alcohol if he wins a battle. And he wins the battle, and he's stuck with this vow. He writes his memoirs particularly about how miserable life is without being able to have a drink.
I'm healthier, but I hate it. Can I also say, I mean, I wholeheartedly believe and trust what you say. But it was also reinforced to me, because when I was doing research on this, I came across my great friend, your great friend, Margaret Macmillan, who has declared Babur as the greatest primary source in history, and absolutely loves the Baburnama and his own sort of, writings about himself and the frankness of them and the humanity of them. And so I thought that was very exciting, that Margaret Macmillan, for those of you who don't know, is a very esteemed historian. The Peacemakers was one of her sort of massive successes.
Won the first Samuel Johnson Prize, I think.
So look, what we're going to do is we're going to split this story up. We're going to start with the origin story. You know how I love my Marvel origin stories, and take you right back to the beginning. We'll have another episode on development. But I should also say, if you are a regular listener to Empire, you can hear these things as they drop. But if you can't wait for this great unfolding story, you need to sign up to our club, empirepoduk.com. And then when we do these mini-series, you get them in one thwacking. So, you could walk your dog till the little thing's legs fall off, and you'll still be with us and we'll still be talking to you. So there we are. There's an incentive. So shall we start with, even before talking about Babur's birth, this idea that he was a Mughal, because he would not have liked to be described as a Mughal, would he? Because Mughal is the bastardization of the term Mongol.
Exactly.
So the Mongols of Genghis Khan and around Mongolia, and he would have really rather that part of his history was slightly dampened down.
Well, that's not quite true, but it wasn't the bit he was most proud of. So Babur, it was his fate to be descended from, well, depending on who you're talking to, the two greatest conquerors in Asian history, or the two most massive mass murderers in the same breath. His mother was descended from Genghis Khan, who was the man who turned the original Mongols in the 12th century and 13th century into this extraordinary world-changing army that just sort of swept all the way from Mongolia through China, right through to Poland and Hungary. His father was descended from someone we've dealt with in the pod before, Timur. And he is, whatever it is, the great-great-great-grandson of Timur. And that was something he was far more proud of, because by the time that Babur was born, the Timurids, far from being this sort of raggedy-taggedy, genocidal, mobile Mongol army, were associated, certainly in his mind and in the eyes of many historians, with high urban Central Asian culture. Some of the great monuments of Samarkand and the area around there. We've dealt with all this in earlier pods, extraordinary feats of astronomy, wonderful paintings, and this incredibly urbane society. And it's Babur's fate to be descended from both of these and to lose this patrimony. He captures some of it. When he's 14, he takes Samarkand.
Wait, can I get all very excitable about something? Because he's the age of my teenager, 14 years old. Can I say, if I can get him to take a used mug downstairs, it is a huge achievement. But there is a series, a really lavish Indian production called The Empires, which goes through the Mughal dynasty. And it begins with the voice of this young boy saying, I was 14 years old and I had defeated death already many times. What else was there to do?
That's rather good.
This is just the trailer. I mean, it's really exciting. And one of the great sort of grand dames of Indian cinema, Shaybani Azmi, appears in it as well, very regal. And at the end of it, you just have this one shot of him on his feet charging towards a war elephant. So it's all very, very exciting. That was one exciting thing, because I was sort of struck when you said Genghis Khan, because people will know that as Genghis Khan, the Mongol terror, Genghis Khan of the steppes. And on the other hand, Timur, which is a name that will not resonate with you unless you've read your Shakespeare and you think of Tamburlaine.
Or listen to Empire Pod.
Or listen to us. I mean, of course, if you listen to us. But those are the way in which those names are transmitted, both as terrors, both as sort of slightly horrifying. One, you can thank Shakespeare, and the other, you can thank numerous historians who thought that Genghis Khan was a barbarian. So there we are. So two barbarian lines. So stop getting excited now.
I loved your quote, and it sounds a wonderful way to open the series. I defeated death. But the wonderful thing about reading Babur's own memoirs, and he writes this beautiful prose. He loves gardens. He loves sunsets. He loves colors. He's just such an attractive character. And in his memoirs, he's not this great conqueror who's defeated death.
No, he's filled with self-doubt. He's human.
I'll read you this little quote, one of my favorite little quotes. Aged, I think, 21, he'd lost everything. He'd lost everything his family had built up. He inherits these two great lineages, and he loses the whole bloody lot by 21.
You're doing spoilers, mate, but read your bit. Read your touching bit. Go on.
And for, I think, 2 or 3 years, he's living in a tent just as a brigand, because he has to, feed himself and feed his family.
Yes.
And there's this lovely little paragraph at the end of this section about how they got stuck in a snowdrift and everything has gone horribly wrong.
I mean, I was literally under strict instructions. Do not let William jump ahead in the story, which is what you're doing. So I'm just saying.
But
what?
But this little sentence, and it says, It passed through my mind that to wander from mountain to mountain, homeless and helpless, has little to recommend it. Isn't that lovely?
But there are lots of very humanizing lines in this. So as I say, the trailer makes him sort of almost godlike, but in reality, a very human account, a very human memoir. We should actually just anchor this in years, shall we? Because this is a man who was born on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, as it turns out, 1483, in a place called Fergana, which is in, as William says, modern day Uzbekistan. I mean, it's a place of plenty when we hear him talking about it, sort of grains, fruits, trees laden with the sweetest of offerings, and pheasants so fat they can barely walk, let alone, sort of jump up off the ground.
I remember that was the first sentence that first attracted me to this book. And it just this image of this fat pheasant just sitting there. That's a pheasant so fat. What does he say? It could feed 4 people.
4 people. One pheasant for 4 people. Exactly right.
And this is all, of course, with the hindsight of someone that's lost it. This is him describing this place, which I've been to Fergana in his footsteps. I'm so obsessed with him that I actually went and did a trip to Uzbekistan specifically to see his childhood, the place of his birth, the place where he had his education, the place where he lived, and then where he lost it all. And the extraordinary thing about Fergana was that it was this place of bounty and beauty. And then when I was growing up and first discovered Babur, everyone told me that it had become this hideous Soviet hellhole, that they had mass farmed cotton as a monoculture. They destroyed the soil was dead, and there were just dead industrial remains of former cotton cultivation. But I never got there at that period of my life, and I only got there, 7 or 8 years ago, when my sister-in-law, as chance would have it, was the UN rep in Tashkent.
Wow.
And so was very well situated for borrowing her car and going off and driving around all the places where he was based. And it was brilliant timing, because in the sort of 20 years since the fall of the Soviet world, everything that is associated with the Soviets had gone. The crumbly old factories had been taken down.
What, blown up and removed? Like actually the masonry removed from the skyline?
Everything removed.
Gosh.
And it had reverted just by default back into this Kashmir-like paradise. So it's now, again, a gorgeous place to visit.
It's reclaimed. How interesting.
Exactly. And you go there, and it's between the 2 great rivers of Central Asia that the Greeks called the Oxus and the Jaxartes. And it's very green. It's very gorgeous. The fortress where he spent his childhood, where his father fell from a fall from his pigeon house, which is another lovely detail, is now a place surrounded by marshes where you can't hear each other if you're walking around with a friend, because there are so many frogs singing to each other.
How very lovely.
And ducks sort of calling to roost. And now, for the first time in probably 100 years, can actually experience the plenty and the beauty and the sense of sort of green heaven that Babur remembers from his childhood, and in middle age, writing his memoirs, writes so nostalgically about.
Now, I have to say, because you know this inside, outside, sideways, and diagonally, I cannot let you throw in little phrases like his daddy fell off a roof. There is a beautiful story attached to this. So Babur, as I said, born in 1483, his father, Umar Sheikh, was the ruler of Fergana. And we've described how wonderful it was. And as a young prince inheriting this is a great prospect, except he inherits it really early on in life. His father, who he describes a little bit like the pheasants, as short and stout, like fat, round-bearded, a fleshy-faced person, he says, loved pigeons, like my friend here, William, and is a really enthusiastic, what do you call them?
Kabuterbaz.
Kabuterbaz, that's it, a kabuterbaz. So one day in this place, in the rugged fort of Akshi, the Fat King is tending his birds on the outer wall. And this is so sweet, as Barbara puts it. And it's sort of overlooking a precipice. And the precipice starts to crumble. And this is what Barbara says. And Umar Sheikh Mirza flew with the pigeons and their house and became a falcon. Ladies and gentlemen, he fell off. He basically fell off and plummeted to his death.
Babur is such a great writer.
Such a great writer. Took off like a falcon. No, fell like a rock. Poor man. Anyway, but that is how Babur, as a young boy, is sort of promoted to be a ruler of a place like Fergana, when he's actually arguably just as still a little boy.
And then he writes in middle age these gorgeous descriptions. I'm just going to read you a little bit. He talks about spring mornings spent in hillsides dotted with wild violets, tulips, and roses, cold running water passing through a shady, delightful clover meadow where every passing traveller takes a rest, beautiful little gardens with almond trees in the orchards, pomegranates renowned for their excellence, good hunting and fowling. And here's our favourite sentence: pheasants which grow so surprisingly fat that rumour has it that 4 people could not finish one, which they were eating with its stew.
So he's nostalgic, and these are the happiest days of his life, melded together with an unhappy thing. Let's talk a little bit more about what he thought of himself. So he would have spoken, and he did write in a language called Turki, Turki, which, I mean, it is obviously shows, sort of the strength of lineage there, because it is a Turkic language. But also that would have been, and will prove to be, very, very useful in the court. It becomes the official Mughal language, but it means you can have a great deal of secrecy when you're invading, because not many people speak it in the places that he's going to go and invade.
But that's not entirely true, because Turki is obviously, as its name implies, one of the Turkish languages, and it's related to this whole body of languages all the way from Istanbul up to Kashgar today. And a lot of the basic words are understood across that. But yes, it's a very particular dialect that these guys speak.
I thought it was that you didn't even need a cipher because people didn't, in the court. That's why it was the chosen thing. But all right, stand corrected. He's 11 years old when his dad takes off like a falcon.
And there's one other nice little description of the dad. I know I'm going backwards, but I just love it so much. My father, he writes, wore his tunic so tight that to fasten the ties he had to draw in his belly. If he let himself go, it happened that the ties tore away. I know that feeling.
Oh, sweet. Oh, sweet.
Later on, he used to have a party once or twice a week. He was good company, talkative, and a well-spoken man. He was fun to be with in a gathering and good at reciting poetry to his companions. We should also say at this point that the very beautiful translation from which I'm reading is the work of somebody called Annette Beveridge, whose grandson went on to found the National Health.
Really, that Beveridge? Oh, that is interesting. So 11-year-old Babur takes over Fergana, but he finds himself in a patchwork of provinces that are governed by various relatives, uncles, cousins. I mean, it's describe the back. It's not like a union.
I think a nest of vipers is actually probably as good a description as any, because he inherits all this. And immediately, every uncle who hasn't inherited wants his castle. So from the very beginning, he is at war with everybody. Among the many people that love the Baburnama, there's E.M. Forster,
Oh, yes.
who wrote a wonderful essay on Babur. And I think we should quote him here because it gives an impression of what happened when Babur inherited this. He says, there were simply too many kings about, often not enough kingdoms.
Yeah.
Tamerlane and Genghis Khan had produced between them so numerous a progeny that a frightful congestion of royalties had resulted in the upper waters of the Jaxartes and Oxus and Afghanistan. One could scarcely travel 2 miles without being held up by an emperor. And Babur himself puts the same thought more succinctly. 10 dervishes can sleep under a single blanket, he wrote, but 2 kings cannot find room under one clime.
Isn't that great? Isn't that terrific? So, it is a tenuous hold that a little boy may have. How does he weather the storm? And I just wanted to know, actually, because is it a nomadic lifestyle or are they anchored to their various fortresses, the uncles and cousins and Babur himself?
It's somewhere in between the two. These are, on both sides, peoples who have been traditionally nomadic and now are conquerors holding territory through castles. So they spend a lot of the time in the saddle fighting each other. They do have fortresses. But in Babur's case, as we will hear, he loses it quite quickly because as well as all these guys fighting each other, there soon appears on the horizon the man who will be the nemesis of Babur, the Timurids, and the man who wrecks this idyllic childhood. And this is this character, the Uzbek warlord, who's one of the most successful warlords, and who's basically the reason that Uzbekistan is called Uzbekistan today is because of this guy. And his full name is Muhammad Shaybani Khan. And he's the one who, just one by one, takes out each of Babur's warring cousins and kinsmen. And none of them, because they're so busy fighting each other, seem to realize the seriousness and that they've got to get themselves together. And Babur writes as the person who, he says, realized it. They went to pieces, he writes, and were unable to do anything. Neither could they gather their men, or were they able to array their own forces. Instead, each set out on his own. I tried to erase the alarm. An enemy like Shaybani Khan had arrived on the scene and posed a threat to Turk and Mughal alike, he wrote. He should be dealt with now, I urged. And while he had not yet totally defeated the nation or grown too strong, as has been said, and then he writes a little verse, put out a fire when you can, for when it blazes high, it will burn the wood. Do not allow an enemy to string his bow while you can pierce him with an arrow.
Isn't that great? Isn't that great? So look, Shaybani Khan is now introduced unto you. Join us after the break when we find out just how everything gets taken away from what is still a young boy. Join us after the break. Welcome back. So we left you with the introduction of this nemesis character, Shaybani Khan, who is after all of the lands, not just of Babur, but all of his relis. Can I just point out that in the I keep going back to this, but it is very beautiful. In this televisual feast that has been created in India of this Babur story, Shaybani Khan is hot. I mean, he's very good looking. That's a description from our producer, Anouska, by the way.
You can't get around it like that. You have a reputation as the boy crazy.
It's entirely
Anita.
fake news.
There we go.
I know, you've made that reputation. But Anouska, true or not true, did you not describe him as hot? She did. So tell me, I mean, what do we know of Shaybani Khan? How old is he when he's sort of picking off Babur relatives?
So I think what you have is on one hand all these sort of old aristocrats who've got used to hunting and feasting and writing poetry and squabbling with each other. And on the other hand, you have a guy who's a real nomad, who's a real nomad prince, who actually is rather more like the Genghis Khans and Timurs that had preceded in previous generations. And these old fat aristocrats with their buttons bursting out from their seams like Babur's dad, busy with their pigeons and their poetry, simply aren't a match for the ruthlessness of this guy. And the final stand, I mean, he picks off every one of these warring uncles and cousins. So the climax comes for poor Babur, who is how old at this point, Anita?
13 years old, so he is still just a boy when he has to face Shaybani Khan. But his first challenge, even before he faces this big bad figure who's taking all the lands of his family, happens in Samarkand. And we ought to say that Samarkand is the prize for many, if not all, of the Timurid leaders, because it is a place of beauty. It is full of bazaars, enchanted gardens, pavilions. The architecture is gorgeous. There are murals depicting Timur's victory, Chinese porcelain tiles. I mean, it is stunning.
It really is. And what has happened is that Timur, 50, 60 years before this, has sort of raided the whole world and destroyed the old order, the whole global order around this whole region, and hauled back everything lovely to Samarkand. So Samarkand reaches its sort of apogee just a generation before Babur. And Timur literally hauls back to Samarkand the greatest craftsmen, the artists, intellectuals from every region he conquers. And through their captive labor, turns the steppeland capital, which before this is quite a minor place, into literally one of the great cities of the world. And it's on his death that you get this extraordinary cultural renaissance, again, just before Babur is born. And the early Timurids who follow Timur, such as Shah Rukh, after whom Shah Rukh Khan is named.
Who's a great Bollywood actor.
Yeah, are known by my great hero, Robert Barron, as the Oriental Medici. And they are these sort of refined litterateurs, connoisseurs of painting, poetry, and calligraphy, scientists, mathematicians, and astronomers. Do you remember we talked about the amazing observatory in Samarkand on an earlier pod?
Yes. And that all the intellectuals were attracted to Samarkand to learn and read from the books in their libraries and so on. Yeah.
Exactly that. So when Babur is growing up, he's growing up, it's like being, growing up in early Renaissance Florence, and Donatello and all these sort of early Renaissance artists are there studying, young Uccello, young Piero della Francesca. And in the case of Babur, it's the greatest of all painters, Bizad, who we talked about. And there's this lovely phrase that Shah Rukh's sons argued over the superior talents of Khusro or Nizami, comparing poems line by line, wrote Babur.
It's lovely and it's romantic. And it is, ironically, for as yet still 13-year-old Babur, it is kind of the thought of romance or love, or at least coupling up with a woman that takes him to Samarkand when he is 13. He marches on the city. And remember, this is not unusual for these relatives to march on each other's territory. So 13-year-old Babur, filled with the first flush of testosterone, in 1496 marches on Samarkand.
He's already seen off two uncles who tried to throw him out by this time.
Who tried to
Only
kill him and
13,
murder him and take Fergana, right?
Yeah.
So he marches to this walled city of Samarkand, and there are two of his cousins who live there. And he wants to marry one of these cousins, because cousin marriage is a thing. But they're both promised to other people. And so what he does, and just put this in your head, this 13-year-old kid lays siege to Samarkand, the jewel in the Timurid crown. Where with all of this, and also the loyalty of your army, that they will, do this for you. 7 months is a very, very long time. And he turns 14, and finally Samarkand falls to him. So it is an extraordinary success, and it sort of really shores up his reputation that, the start of that trailer, at 14, I had cheated deaths many times. And he sort of marches into Samarkand. What else is left?
But he's your son's age.
Oh my God. I mean, honestly, it's just baffling. They were made of different stuff back then. But all these, the pavilions, the gardens, all of this is his. But it doesn't last long, does it, William?
It absolutely doesn't.
It's about sort of 3 months he gets to enjoy it. And then what happens?
Then he's thrown out by another uncle, isn't he? It's an uncle. And then Shaybani Khan comes when the Timurids, as ever, are squabbling among each other. And it is just a line of skittles after that, one after another. Each uncle refuses to join up with the others. There's no united response. Village after village, castle after castle goes down. The Uzbeks are growing. And he's 21 when he has this sort of terrible final stand. And it's in his birthplace of Akshi in June 1503. And his men are outnumbered. There's only about 400 of them. The Uzbeks are about 10 times that number. And by the evening, Babur has to blow the retreat, and he's leading his last companions through the east gate, fleeing for their lives. And he describes all this in great detail. He says that we were running through the orchards below as the Uzbeks pursued them on horse. There was no time to make a stand or delay. We went off quickly, the enemy unhorsing our men. And this is when one of the great disasters takes place. And Babur only realizes it as he's running away because the women have been left behind. And Babur's half-sister, who's called Yadgar Sultan Begum, has been captured, and Shaybani Khan wants to marry her. These guys think the Uzbeks are kind of just pure barbarians. They're sitting there like some sort of literary conference, going through poems line by line, and the Uzbek turn up while they're doing all this and take advantage. And he writes, "It was a miserable position for me. I remained behind. I was alone." And he hides, and then he's discovered. But somehow he manages to convince the Uzbeks that he will reward them handsomely if he lets them escape. So he then spends another year wandering forlornly from cousin to cousin, looking for opportunities to make a comeback, but without success. He says, "I endured much poverty and humiliation. I had no country or the hope of one. Most of my retainers dispersed, and those left were unable to move around because of destitution. It came very hard on me, and I could not help crying."
Yes, I know. It came very hard on me. A 14-year-old saying, I cried my eyes out. But also, he doesn't just lose Samarkand, he loses Fergana. He calls it himself, which also, I love the honesty of this, the throneless time. The throneless times when a man who was born to be king has nothing at all but fear and movement. So, the throneless times, he has nowhere to put his roots down. Does he have anywhere in mind as a haven where he can hide and regroup and maybe set down roots again?
So for a while, they just hide in their old territories, going from mountain to mountain, cave to cave, and trying to rally these hopeless uncles who, again, still sort of just fighting with each other. And he writes, "For more than 140 years, these lands had belonged to our dynasty. Now we were all reduced to utter destitution." And what he has to do is he has to go south, which from Uzbekistan means going into what is now northern Afghanistan. And he's got nothing. He's got no gold. He didn't manage to save anything. And he is now literally a brigand, a fugitive.
There are great accounts, again, in his memoirs about, how they would rather not fight if they didn't have to. They would put ladders up against sort of the village walls. And if they could sneak in and take what provisions they needed to survive, they would. But if they had to fight, they would fight, and they fought well. And just tell me, during this time, does he have family? Does he have, does he have love in his life?
So love, again, is a complicated thing at this point, and it's a very difficult notion for us to take on board because we have such clear ideas what love means. And for Babur, women are about marriage and duty, and it's boys which are for pleasure.
So we're talking, he's 16 years old when he first starts talking about, his desire and writing about the fact that he has desires for boys, boy love.
He hasn't fallen in love yet, but he does talk about this first love, which is a bit later in Herat, which we'll come to in a bit. And that's a wonderful story. And he describes it so beautifully. It's not love that's got him in a whirl. It is just having lost everything. He says, "I was fugitive, homeless, and utterly bewildered, not knowing where to go or where to stay. Our heads were all in a whirl." And what they decide to do eventually is to give up and go and look for a new land to the south. And the boundary, which is the sort of, for him, the boundary between civilization and the unknown, is the Oxus. And there's this moment when he takes the ferry over the Oxus, which is the kind of moment when he's saying to himself that it's all over and that there's no chance ever of returning to his homeland. Because beyond that lies the snowy wastes of the Hindu Kush. And he says, no plan or destination other than to put as much space as possible between ourselves and the Uzbeks. Those who, hoping in me, went with me into exile were small and great, between 200 and 300. They were almost all on foot, had walking staves in their hands, rough boots of untanned leather on their feet, and long coats. So destitute were we that we had but 2 tents among us. My tent, which used to be pitched for my mother. But what happens is that, in a sense, the sheer scale of the disaster plays into his hands. And As they're heading slowly southwards on foot, they're joined by more and more of these hopeless uncles who, one by one, are losing their castles and their villages. And he says that in the months that followed, one man after another came in and joined our party. And then he says, I didn't allow myself to give way to despair. When one has pretensions to rule and a desire for conquest, one cannot sit back and watch if events do not go right once or twice. Isn't that a lovely sentence?
It is lovely.
So what begins as a kind of sprawling refugee column, and this lovely image of these guys with staves and kind of messy, unworked boots, slowly grows over the course of the next months and seasons into a new Timurid army, because he's the only one that's got out with his family intact.
And also with a reputation of winning battles. He's defeated some of these already. So, they are coalescing around him. His marriage is also arranged at this time by his mother. But as you say, women are for procreation, not for love. And I mean, something is up because he's 16 years old. He has, had his marriage arranged. But you can tell that this conflict is going on because he doesn't really want to have sex with her. And he only does so, we are told, once every 40 days, and only when his mother gets on his case saying, I want a grandchild. Where is my grandchild? I want my grandchild. But he does in this time. And again, it's this sort of searing honesty. He talks about his attraction to boys, and it is boys rather than men.
Which is not unusual for this time and this society.
It is unusual because Babur, in later life, disapproves of homosexuality among his courtiers. This is what's weird to me. So at the beginning, let's talk about Babur the Younger. Babur the Younger talks about this one time in a camp bazaar, because as you say, they're on the run. They're getting more and more people who are joining them, but in one of the camps that he is in, he's mooning about and, he's sort of in the camp bazaar. He's thinking about life. He's thinking about, his surroundings and nature, as you say, sort of, waxing lyrical about the gardens and the grass and the flowers. The way he says it, the way he tells the story, he turns a corner on one of these narrow lanes in a bazaar, and he comes face to face with a boy. And he describes himself as being so covered in confusion that he can't even look at him in the eye. And he sort of asks for him to be sent to him. And he's in a real quandary about this, because on the one hand, he's so confused and overwhelmed by passion. He wants to see him. But on the other hand, he can't look at him. And he writes about this. He goes, in my joy and agitation, I could not thank him for coming. How is it possible for me to reproach him for going away? He just doesn't know what to do with all of his feelings. Like as a proper first crush. And that really surprises me. We'll talk about Babur later. But to go through that transition of understanding boy love and not being extraordinary for having it at that time, to then repudiating it utterly in later life. What's that about, mate? What is that about?
I hadn't taken in the later repudiation. These passages about his early crushes are very famous.
So anyway, look, with this conflicted teenage hormonal thing going on, so he's now looking towards Afghanistan. And what happens then?
The Oxus is the boundary today between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. So in modern terms, his refugee column, all these guys with their staves, are marching into Afghanistan over the Hindu Kush. And what's initially just 200 or 300 people, because of the complete failure of all the Timurid cousins, 2 years later, by Nowruz, just as he's coming down from the heights of the Hindu Kush, Babur's column has actually swelled to a staggering 20,000 men. It's a proper army. And that same year, 1504, Babur finally has what is his first lucky break for many years. He is approaching Kabul, which was not, as we think of it today, kind of war-torn, messed up, much invaded mess. It was the richest and most cosmopolitan city in the whole of what's now Afghanistan, the center of a really rich caravan trade between India and Central Asia. And what was Babur's great stroke of luck was that there was, at that moment, a particularly unpopular ruler, widely considered to be himself a usurper. And the local Afghan chiefs, and he has the wind of this, are ready for a change. So, to their own surprise, Babur now draws up this army, and he takes the city without a battle, just by staring them down. He lines up his army in ranks below the fort, still there to this day, called the Bala Hissar, And he writes in his diary, those inside the fort became much perturbed and made an offer of submission and surrender. And so once he's got this center, Bala is the great fortress of Afghanistan. And once he's inside, Babur is able to call more of his fractious Timurid cousins to build up his numbers. And they're joined by other refugees, tribes, and clans who've been displaced by the Uzbeks. And he makes coalition with others of the Afghans. And this is what's so odd for us today, is that the same guy who's writing about boy love, about the smell of burning leaves, about the gorgeous sunsets that he's seeing while crossing the Hindu Kush, then writes with equal accuracy and without any attempt to cover up what he's doing about how he imposes his rule on the area around Kabul. And the answer is raids, burning villages, impaling rebels, and enslavement. And so, is Babur a poet or is he a war criminal? The answer is, rather distressingly, both at the same time. The same guy who can be so sensitive and who records things so beautifully is also capable of impaling people. And that, to us, is an odd mixture of qualities, but it seems to be very much part of the, if you think of the Tudors or think of the Medicis, these are very brutal times.
So now you've got Babur, who maybe thinks for the first time in his very young life, okay, I've been chased from my home. I've been let down by all my bloody useless relatives. But maybe here in Kabul, which he describes as kind of a land of milk and honey, really, a little bit like he thinks about Fergana, these lush groves and trees that are heavy, the boughs heavy with fruit. He thinks he might be able to put down roots. It should be said, though, somebody is watching his progress with a great deal of interest. You remember we talked about Shaybani Khan, the man who has chased him out of Samarkand, who has taken Fergana, who is mopping up all of these Timurid lands and taking them without really much bother at all. And he also watches young Babur, who's only 18 at this point, sort of almost getting a little too comfortable in Kabul and maybe thinking to himself, you think you're safe, mate? You got another thing coming. But what is going on in Babur's head?
Well, you're quite right. Shaybani Khan comes into this story again. This is not the last we've heard of Shaybani Khan, because remember, he's now, on top of everything else, he's Babur's brother-in-law. He's taken the captive sister of Babur, which is a massive humiliation for Babur. But for the time being, Babur is okay. He's got a new base. He's got a new castle. The Bala Hisar of Kabul is a bigger castle than the one he's lost in Akshi and in Fergana. And we have now one of the most gorgeous sections of the Baburnama because Babur is happy. Babur is now being recognized by many of his useless uncles as the leader of the Timurids. He's the guy that's captured Kabul. He's the guy with the reputation. And so although Shaybani Khan is
licking his lips and watching,
his lips and wondering, and we will come back to him, for the next few years, Babur is free to enjoy his new conquest. So what happens, and this is very important for the future, because it not only determines the way that Babur behaves, his descendants copy this and see this as the example of civilized, courtly behavior, which sets the pattern later for the Mughals in India. So the first thing he does after he captures Kabul is he lays out a 4-part Charbagh Persian garden, and he remodels it according to his taste.
Oh, well, you need to describe what a charbagh. You see, you use these phrases like everybody knows. What is a charbagh garden? It's a very specific Mughal gift to the world. I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, they don't invent it, actually. It's a Mughal gift to India, but it's something which the ancient Persians originally invented. And what it is basically just taking a rectangular garden and dividing it in 4 with runnels of water. So you have running down the center and from either of the cross axes, runnels of water, which are often powered by something called a Persian screw, which is basically kind of a giant corkscrew pushed by bullocks. And the bullocks go round and round and round with this thing, and that moves the water around or draws it up from a meadow.
So you have the sound of water, the coolness of the water. And charbagh, I mean, literally translated as 4 gardens. So those are the 4 quadrants that you're talking about.
It's the 4 quadrants, yeah. And he says very proudly, and this is one of the reasons that the British always love Babur, because he's a gardener. He's like sort of Vita Sackville West or something on top of everything else. And he talks proudly about introducing bananas and sugar into the area and setting up his new Timurid court in exile in the gardens and in the palace. Again, we think of a garden as something outside, and then we have houses where we live inside. The semi-nomadic post-Timur, post-Mongol Mughals often see the gardens as the center of their life. It's where you lay out a carpet, you have your lunch, you organize your business, you do your justice. And he loves, as you say, this familiar landscape and the climate.
But it's not just that. There is something else that he loves. If you look at his writing, what else he loves about Kabul? Because this is like basically a country hick boy who's only known one part of the world. Kabul is a crossroads for trade. And as is nearby Kandahar, is a crossroads for trade.
And even more, and we'll have this in the next episode, is Herat. Herat is the greatest and most cosmopolitan of all.
So he sees the caravans coming from India, Persia, Iraq, and Turkey. And for the first time, this young man's eyes open wide. There is a world, perhaps a world for me to conquer.
But at this point, he's just happy where he is. And he says, I hunted, I fished, I hawked, I held parties on the green hills around the city. I wrote poetry. And there's one other thing we know he did, which was develop his own form of calligraphy, weirdly enough, something called the Kati Baburi, which is a new script, which he works on at this period. It's also at this period that he fathers his children, including in 1508 his son Humayun, who we're going to hear a lot more of later.
Oh, his mother will be delighted. I mean, he really was
Finally,
dragging his heels, wasn't he? Yeah.
But it's also, and this is some of the passages that I love most about this book, and it's a time when Babur is able to have the time to experiment in life's different pleasures. And so he talks about investigating the differing effects of opium and hashish and records, quote, that while under its influence, wonderful fields of flowers were enjoyed, sheets of yellow and sheets of red, not what we imagined medieval rulers doing. We sat on a mound near the camp and just enjoyed the sight. And then on another occasion, and this is one of my favorite passages, he takes a party of nobles on a boating trip, not realizing that one end of the boat his friends are eating hashish, while at the other end they're drinking wine. And he writes, and this is a great bit of advice for anyone, a hashish party never goes well with a wine party, he wrote.
Such wise words.
The drinkers begin to make wild talk and chatter from all sides, mostly in allusion to hashish and hashish eaters. Baba Jan, when drunk, said many wild things. The drinkers made Tadi Khan mad drunk by giving him one full bowl and then another. Try as we might to keep things straight, nothing went well. There was much disgusting uproar. The party became intolerable and was broken up, which is a brilliant description.
He does say, he describes this time that he has in Kabul, the island of Kabul, he refers to it as. And he says, it was the most free from care or sorrow of any time that I have ever experienced. I never suffered even a headache unless from the effects of wine. I never felt distressed or sad except on account of the ringlets of some beloved one. He was having rather a lovely time. That nice phrase.
I think this is a good place to end it. A happy bubble.
Is it going to be happily ever after? No.
Nope.
Is this a happily ever after for this story? It is not. So join us next time for the next instalment of The Life of Babur. Till the next time we meet, it's goodbye from me, Anita Anand.
And goodbye from me, William Dalrymple.